My heart stopped for 3 minutes, and what I saw changed my belief forever. Ex-Atheist testimony. I grew up in a home where God was never part of the conversation. We didn't pray before meals, we didn't go to church on Sundays, and the Bible was just another book gathering dust on a forgotten shelf. If someone mentioned God, my parents would shrug it off like it was irrelevant, something people only clung to when they didn't have answers. For me, that became normal. Faith wasn't rejected outright. It was simply ignored, treated as unnecessary. I learned early on that religion was for other families, not ours. Some of my earliest memories involve hearing neighbors talk about church and Sunday school. Kids my age would get dressed up and head out every weekend. But for me, Sundays were about cartoons, chores, or just another day. I remember asking my mom once why we didn't go like everyone else, and she smiled and said, "That's not really for us." And that was all the explanation I ever got, and I accepted it without question. To me, church was something distant, almost foreign, like a tradition that didn't belong to us. Holidays reflected the same emptiness. Christmas was about presents and food, never about Jesus. Easter was about candy and egg hunts, nothing more. I didn't even realize those celebrations had deeper meanings until much later in life. At the time, it felt perfectly normal to celebrate without faith, to strip away the sacred and focus only on the fun. Looking back now, it's clear that my foundation was built on shallow pleasures, not on truth. But as a child, I didn't know what I was missing. Whenever I did encounter religion, it felt awkward and unnecessary. A school friend once invited me to a church event, and I remember sitting there confused, watching people sing with their eyes closed, hands raised. I thought it was strange, even silly. When someone prayed, I felt embarrassed, like I was watching something private I didn't understand. Instead of curiosity, I felt distance. It reinforced the idea that faith was not part of my world, and I didn't belong in those spaces. My parents never spoke badly about God. They simply acted like he wasn't there. That silence shaped me more than I realized. Without anyone pointing me toward faith, I grew up thinking life was meant to be lived without needing a higher power. My role models valued education, hard work, and independence, but never spirituality. So I copied them. I learned to rely on myself, to trust only what I could see, touch, and measure. By default, I inherited their indifference and wore it as my own. I remember being curious at times, though I would never admit it. If I heard a story about miracles or heaven, something inside me wondered if it could be true. But those thoughts were quickly buried, drowned out by the voices around me. My parents would laugh at anything that sounded superstitious. So I learned to laugh too, even if deep down I still had questions. That became my habit, masking wonder with mockery. It was easier to dismiss than to believe. School only strengthened this mindset. Teachers praised science, logic, and reason as the ultimate tools for understanding the world. Anything outside that framework was treated as fantasy. I absorbed those lessons eagerly because they matched what I already saw at home. By the time I was a teenager, I was confident that I didn't need faith. I thought I was smarter than those who believed, that I had access to the real truth. Looking back, I see it wasn't truth I was clinging to. It was pride. In conversations with other kids, I often rolled my eyes when they talked about God. I would joke about how religion was outdated, something people invented to explain things before science existed. Most of the time, people didn't push back. They'd laugh awkwardly and change the subject. That gave me even more confidence to dismiss faith as irrelevant. I didn't realize it then, but I was already building a wall between myself and anything spiritual. It started with indifference, but soon grew into open mockery. Deep down, though, there was always a quiet emptiness I couldn't name. Even as a child, I sometimes felt a longing for something greater, though I didn't know what it was. Nights lying awake, staring at the ceiling, I would wonder where everything came from, what happened after death. But without guidance, those thoughts faded. I buried them under distractions, games, and later, ambitions. The seeds of doubt about my disbelief were there, but I ignored them. That silence at home had already trained me well. Looking back on my childhood now, I see how much it shaped my path. I didn't grow up angry at God. I grew up blind to Him. I didn't reject faith because I studied it and found it lacking. I rejected it because I never knew it at all. That ignorance became arrogance as I got older. My foundation was emptiness, and I built my identity on top of it. I thought that was strength, but it was weakness disguised. My childhood without faith set the stage for pride, rebellion, and eventually a fall I never saw coming. As I moved into my teenage years, my indifference toward God hardened into mockery. It wasn't enough for me to ignore faith anymore. I began to openly ridicule it. Whenever classmates talked about church or prayer, I would smirk and roll my eyes. If someone shared that they believed God had helped them, I was quick to shoot back with sarcastic comments. I thought I was being clever, even brave, by exposing what I saw as foolishness. In reality, I was just building walls of pride, brick by brick. Science became my weapon of choice. I loved repeating phrases I barely understood, quoting theories as if they were absolute proof that God was unnecessary. Whenever someone mentioned creation or miracles, I countered with evolution, physics, or psychology. I wasn't an expert, but I didn't need to be. Just sounding confident was enough to make others doubt themselves. My arrogance grew as I silenced voices of faith with sharp words. I believed logic was all I needed and that it made me superior. Looking back, I can see how cruel I was to people who only wanted to share what gave them hope. But at the time, I enjoyed the power of making them uncomfortable. If someone bowed their head to pray before lunch, I would laugh and ask, "Do you really think God cares about your sandwich?" My friends would laugh along, and I would feel victorious. Every joke felt like proof that I was smarter, sharper, and stronger than those who believed. I mistook mockery for strength. Teachers unknowingly fueled my pride. They praised critical thinking and dismissed faith as outdated. To me, their approval was validation that I was on the right path. I soaked it in, repeating their words outside of class as if they were my own discoveries. When they spoke about the power of science, I nodded with enthusiasm, convinced that only facts mattered. Religion, in my mind, belonged to the past, a relic for people too afraid to face reality. I carried that belief like a badge of honor. During this time, my circle of friends also shaped me. Most of them weren't deeply religious, and some enjoyed the way I challenged others. My boldness gave them an excuse to stay silent about their own questions. I became the loud one, the debater, the self-proclaimed truth-teller. But in truth, I wasn't leading them toward truth. I was dragging them further into doubt. My influence wasn't wisdom, it was poison wrapped in confidence. And the more I spoke, the more I believed my own lies. There were moments when my cruelty stung others more deeply than I realized. A girl in my class once shared about her church helping her through family struggles. Instead of showing compassion, I laughed and told her she was clinging to fairy tales. I'll never forget the way her smile faded. At the time, I brushed it off as a win, but looking back, I see how damaging my words were. I was tearing down people's faith without offering them anything to replace it with, just emptiness. I developed a kind of prideful script. Whenever God was mentioned, I had quick responses ready. Show me proof. Science explains that. Faith is for the weak. I repeated those lines so often that they became automatic, like reflexes. People began to expect me to speak up, and I enjoyed that role. It made me feel powerful, even respected. But underneath, it was all noise. I had never truly wrestled with the questions I mocked. I only borrowed arguments to mask my own uncertainty. The more I mocked, the more I convinced myself I was right. I couldn't allow myself to consider that believers might know something I didn't. Pride wouldn't let me admit that, so I built higher walls, louder defenses, sharper jokes. Faith, in my mind, was a disease, and I thought I was the cure. The irony was that I wasn't curing anything. I was sick myself, but too blind to notice. My arrogance made me deaf to truth, and I wore that deafness like a crown. Sometimes, though, I wondered why faith made people so resilient. I saw classmates endure pain and loss, yet still smile, still hope, still pray. Deep down, I was curious how they found strength, but instead of asking, I mocked even louder. Mockery was safer than admitting envy. It was easier to laugh than to admit I wanted what they had. I told myself their peace was fake, but in quiet moments, I wished I could feel it too. Pride silenced that longing every time it rose. By the end of my teenage years, my identity was firmly rooted in mockery and pride. I was the one who made fun of Christians, the one who proved science had all the answers, the one who laughed at prayer. My heart grew colder with each passing year, and my words sharper. I thought I was free, but I was enslaved to arrogance. I thought I was strong, but I was hiding weakness. And little did I know, the very God I mocked was already watching, waiting, and preparing to break through my walls. Death was something I thought about often, but never with fear. To me, it was simple. When you die, everything just shuts off, like a light switch flipped to darkness. No heaven, no hell, no judgment, just nothingness. That belief gave me a strange kind of comfort because I told myself it meant there was nothing to worry about, no consequences, no afterlife, no God waiting on the other side, just silence and blackness forever. I repeated that thought until it became a shield. Whenever someone talked about eternity, I almost laughed. Eternity didn't exist in my worldview. Life was just biology, cells, neurons, chemicals firing in the brain. When those stopped, the person was gone. Simple as that. I thought believers were wasting their short lives preparing for a future that wasn't real. I told myself I was the one living honestly, facing the truth that life had no grand meaning beyond survival. And yet, that truth carried an emptiness I didn't dare acknowledge. I even prided myself on how rational I sounded when I explained death. We don't fear sleep, so why fear death, I would say. It's just endless sleep, nothing more. That became one of my favorite lines, and people would nod, sometimes even agree. Their agreement fed my arrogance. I wanted to believe my perspective was brave, that I was facing reality head-on while others clung to myths. In my mind, Christians were simply afraid of the dark, inventing a light switch that never existed. Still, deep inside, the thought of nothingness was haunting. I wouldn't admit it, but the idea of ceasing to exist gnawed at me in quiet moments. If life truly ended in darkness, then nothing I did really mattered. Success, failure, love, pain, none of it would last. It would all vanish into silence. I fought against that thought with more arguments, louder and harsher, but it never fully left me. I buried the discomfort under layers of pride, pretending it didn't exist. Sometimes at night, staring at the ceiling, I would wonder if I was lying to myself. What if there was something beyond the darkness? What if death wasn't the end? The questions came like whispers, but I silenced them with anger. No, I told myself, science is clear, death is final. I clung to that conviction like a lifeline because the alternative terrified me more than I could admit. The thought of accountability to a God I mocked was unbearable, so I shut it down. I began using death as a way to challenge believers. If heaven is real, prove it, I'd say with a smirk. Or if there's life after death, where's the evidence? I wanted them to stumble, to have no answers, so I could feel superior. Every debate was a battle I thought I was winning. But in truth, I wasn't searching for answers. I was running from them. I wasn't curious about eternity. I was hiding from the possibility that eternity might be real. The finality of death became a twisted kind of comfort zone for me. If everything ended at death, then I owed nothing to anyone beyond this life. No judgment, no moral standard higher than my own. I could decide what was right and wrong, and death would erase it all anyway. That belief gave me the illusion of freedom. I thought I was liberated, but really I was enslaved. to selfishness, to arrogance, to emptiness disguised as logic. My freedom was a cage I couldn't see. I remember one funeral that tested my conviction. A classmate had died in an accident, and everyone around me was grieving. People talked about seeing him again someday, about him being in a better place. I mocked those words in my head, but as I looked at his coffin, I felt a chill. If I'm right, I thought, then he's just gone, forever. That thought should have comforted me, but it didn't. Instead, it felt cruel, hopeless, like a void swallowing everything. Even in my boldest moments of atheism, I couldn't shake that void. The darkness I claimed to accept still scared me, but I would never admit it to anyone, not even to myself. I wore my conviction like armor, convincing everyone I was fearless. My favorite line became, "Faith is just wishful thinking for people afraid of death." I repeated it like a mantra, louder each time, hoping it would drown out the quiet voice inside me that whispered, "What if you're wrong?" By the end of those years, my conviction was ironclad, or so I thought. Death was the end, nothing more. I was certain of it. I carried that belief like a flag, waving it proudly in debates, in classrooms, even in casual conversations. To me, God was a fairy tale, heaven was a fantasy, and hell was a scare tactic. I believed I had conquered fear by embracing darkness. What I didn't realize was that the darkness I embraced was slowly consuming me from the inside. I carried my atheism like a badge of honor, a medal that proved I was smarter than the rest. Whenever I walked into a room where religion came up, I positioned myself as the logical one. I thought I had superior knowledge, the kind that freed me from childish beliefs. If someone mentioned God, I would smirk, roll my eyes, and launch into what I believed were irrefutable arguments. In my mind, people of faith were living in an illusion, and I was the one who could see the truth. That pride made me arrogant in ways I didn't even recognize at the time. I wasn't just doubting God, I was mocking him, mocking anyone who dared to believe. I felt intellectually untouchable, as if my rejection of faith elevated me above others. When friends prayed or talked about miracles, I would scoff loudly. I wanted them to feel small, naive, and foolish for trusting in something I claimed didn't exist. I thought I was helping them wake up, but in reality, I was feeding my ego. The more I argued, the more I convinced myself that I was the enlightened one. I used science as my weapon, though I often bent facts to fit my point. If someone couldn't answer a question about their faith, I'd declare victory. I saw their silence not as humility, but as weakness. It fueled my pride, and I loved the feeling of superiority it gave me. I didn't just want to be right. I wanted to prove believers wrong and humiliate them for believing. Even casual conversations turned into opportunities to show off my rational mind. I would bring up evolution, cosmology, or psychology, not to genuinely discuss, but to prove that everything about religion was obsolete. If someone said they believed God gave their life meaning, I would laugh and say meaning was something we create for ourselves. I was certain I had figured it all out, and anyone who disagreed with me was simply clinging to fairy tales. My pride had blinded me completely. I loved to repeat my favorite line, "If God is real, let him prove it." To me, it was the ultimate trump card, the question no believer could answer. Every time I said it, I felt powerful, like I was challenging the universe itself and winning. I thought no one, not even God, could meet that demand. That phrase became a banner I waved proudly in every discussion. It wasn't a question anymore. It was a declaration of victory over faith. Deep down, though, there was a hollowness in my triumph. I thought being rational made me stronger, but my need to prove others wrong revealed the opposite. If I was so confident in my beliefs, why did I feel the urge to constantly defend them with such aggression? The truth was that pride had become my identity. I needed to be the smartest, the most logical, the one who couldn't be fooled. Faith wasn't just something I rejected, it was something I despised because it threatened my ego. When I saw people of faith living with peace, I told myself it was fake. I said their calmness was ignorance, their joy was delusion, their prayers were self-deception. It was easier to believe that than to admit I lacked the peace they had. My pride wouldn't allow me to wonder if maybe they possessed something real, something I didn't understand. I had to keep telling myself I was above them, that I was smarter, or else my entire worldview would begin to crack. This arrogance seeped into every part of my life. In school, I sought debates. At work, I avoided believers. In relationships, I dismissed anyone who took faith seriously. I wanted to surround myself with people who thought like me because it affirmed my sense of superiority. But even then, there were cracks in the facade. I noticed that my rational circle often lacked depth, love, or true connection. But instead of questioning that, I doubled down on my pride, telling myself emotion was weakness. Looking back, I realized that pride was my armor. It protected me from vulnerability, from admitting I didn't have all the answers. Pretending to be the rational one gave me a sense of control, but it was fragile. Every time someone expressed unshakable faith, I felt something stir inside me, a mix of anger and fear. My pride told me to laugh at them, but in reality, their quiet confidence exposed how unstable my own certainty really was. By then, I had built my entire identity on being smarter than believers. And my pride was like a fortress I lived in, high walls that kept truth out. I didn't realize that fortress was also a prison. I thought my rational superiority gave me freedom, but in reality, it locked me deeper into arrogance and blindness. I wasn't seeing more clearly than others. I was the one refusing to see. And yet I continued to boast, blind to the cracks forming in my proud convictions. When I first entered adulthood, it felt like everything was finally going my way. I got a decent job, one that paid enough to cover my bills and give me freedom. For the first time, I felt independent, in control of my own destiny. I didn't need anyone telling me what to do, and I especially didn't need God. My achievements became proof, at least to me, that I was on the right path. I thought I had built my life with my own hands, without divine help. With money coming in, I began to surround myself with friends, or at least, that's what I called them. Most of these friendships were shallow, built around parties, jokes, and late nights. We didn't talk about deep things, and that was fine with me. As long as they laughed at my jokes and shared drinks, I felt accepted. I thought that was all friendship was supposed to be. People to fill the silence, not people to walk through real struggles with you. Relationships came and went like seasons. I dated women who at the time seemed to bring excitement into my life. But none of those connections lasted long because I wasn't looking for depth. I didn't want commitment, and I certainly didn't want anything that involved faith or morality. I told myself love was just chemistry, nothing more. When things fell apart, I shrugged and said, that's life. But deep down, every breakup left me emptier than before. The more I achieved, the more I fed my pride. My job gave me a title, my friends gave me attention, and my relationships gave me temporary thrills. It all added up to what looked like success from the outside. I looked in the mirror and told myself I had made it, that I was strong, independent, and free. But beneath all that noise, something inside me knew it was fragile. I kept myself busy so I wouldn't have to hear the silence. I filled my calendar with endless distractions. Weekends meant bars, concerts, or trips with friends. Workdays meant chasing recognition from bosses and colleagues. I didn't allow myself downtime because in quiet moments I would feel something pressing against me, a hollowness I didn't want to face. I drowned it out with noise, laughter, and the next adventure. My life looked exciting to others, but it was built on constant motion, always running from stillness. There were times when I would lay in bed after a long night out and wonder if any of it mattered. The laughter from friends faded quickly, the thrill of relationships ended in emptiness, and even the pride of success wore off. But instead of admitting that, I would double down. I'd plan the next outing, the next date, the next way to prove I was living life to the fullest. I refused to accept that maybe all of it was surface level, nothing real beneath it. I saw myself as untouchable. I had money, I had people around me, and I had experiences that looked enviable. Whenever someone from my past mentioned God or church, I dismissed it as weakness. Look at me, I thought. I'm doing just fine without faith. I believed my life was evidence against God. If he existed, why did I seem to thrive while ignoring him? That thought gave me pride, but it also whispered something uncomfortable I kept ignoring. At work, I climbed small ladders of success, promotions, raises, recognition. All the things that fuel pride came my way. I used them to measure my worth, to prove I was better than the people still stuck in religion. I believed achievement was the only proof I needed of a meaningful life. Yet every success only brought me temporary satisfaction. No matter how high I climbed, I always felt the need to climb higher, as though I was chasing something just out of reach. Looking back now, I can see that my so-called independence was a fragile illusion. I thought freedom meant living without boundaries, but it was really loneliness, dressed up as success. My friendships couldn't stand the weight of hardship, my relationships dissolved when tested, and my achievements failed to satisfy me for more than a few moments. But at the time, I refused to see it. Pride kept me blind and noise kept me distracted from the truth. In those years, I believed I was on top of the world. People saw me as confident, strong, and self-made. I played the part so well that even I believed it. But beneath it all, I was just a man stacking accomplishments like sandcastles, pretending they were stone. I had no foundation, only pride. And though I couldn't see it yet, the waves were already forming on the horizon, ready to wash everything away. Even in the middle of my so-called victories, there was always a strange emptiness lingering inside me. After a night out with friends, when the laughter faded, I felt it. After achieving something at work, when the congratulations were over, I felt it again. It was like a shadow that followed me everywhere, showing up whenever the noise stopped. I couldn't explain it, and I didn't want to, so I buried it, pretending it wasn't there, telling myself it was normal. The emptiness didn't come with loud alarms. It came quietly, in moments of silence. Lying in bed after a long day, I would feel a heaviness in my chest. Walking home alone after being surrounded by people, I felt a loneliness I couldn't shake. I kept asking myself, why does this feel so hollow? Isn't this what life is supposed to be? But instead of looking deeper, I drowned those questions with distractions, always searching for the next noise to silence them. I convinced myself the feeling was temporary, just stress or exhaustion. I'll feel better once I go out again, I thought. Or I just need another promotion, another relationship, another trip. I treated the emptiness like a hunger that could be fed with success, entertainment, or companionship. But no matter what I gave it, the hunger returned, stronger than before. It was as if the very things I trusted to fill me were only making the hole inside me deeper. The more I tried to ignore it, the louder it became. Sometimes I would wake up in the middle of the night, my mind racing. Is this all there is? I wondered. Work, parties, relationships, and then death? I hated those thoughts, so I fought them with pride. I told myself I was smarter than those who looked for meaning in faith, but deep down, I knew I didn't have real answers. My pride kept me loud, but my soul was whispering the truth I didn't want to face. I started noticing how fragile my happiness really was. One bad day at work could undo a week of feeling proud. One fight with a friend or partner could send me spiraling into loneliness. My peace was so dependent on circumstances, and it slipped through my fingers constantly. Still, I pretended to be fine. I wore a smile, told jokes, and acted confident. Nobody could see the battle inside me because I was too proud to let them. I thought weakness was failure. There were moments when I caught glimpses of something different in others. I remember seeing a Christian co-worker who seemed genuinely calm, even when life was hard for her. I told myself she was just naive, using faith as a crutch. But part of me envied her peace. I couldn't understand how she could be steady while I felt like I was constantly spinning. I wanted what she had, but admitting that would mean questioning everything I built my pride on. So I doubled down on the mask. I told more jokes, went to more parties, worked harder, and dated more. I tried to fill every hour with something that distracted me. I thought if I stayed busy enough, I would outrun the emptiness. But no matter how much I achieved or how many people I surrounded myself with, the silence always came back. And when it did, I felt like I was falling into a void that nothing could fill. I remember one night clearly, sitting alone after everyone left, staring at the empty bottles on the table. The room was quiet, and for once I couldn't escape it. The thought hit me hard. Why do I feel so alone when I have everything I wanted? That night I felt the weight of the emptiness heavier than ever before. I wanted to shake it off, but it clung to me like a shadow, reminding me that something was deeply missing. At times I wondered if maybe the believers were right, if maybe there was something more. But as soon as the thought came, I crushed it with anger. I told myself it was weakness, a lapse in rationality. I swore I wouldn't give in to that kind of thinking. I convinced myself I was too strong, too intelligent to fall for religion. Yet the more I resisted, the more restless I became. The emptiness grew with every attempt to deny it. Looking back, I realized that the emptiness was a warning. It was like a quiet signal that no achievement, no friendship, and no relationship could replace what my soul was really longing for. At the time, I didn't recognize it. I thought I was winning at life, but inside I was crumbling. The victories I boasted about were hollow, and the independence I praised was just a mask. Beneath it all, I was a man starving for meaning, but too proud to admit it. It was during a late-night gathering with friends that the conversation took a sharp turn toward God and faith. We had been laughing, drinking, and sharing stories, but someone brought up the topic of heaven. I could feel my pride ignite immediately, as if I had been waiting for this moment. I leaned forward, smirking, ready to show off my so-called wisdom. I wanted to make sure everyone in that room knew where I stood on the subject. As the discussion grew deeper, a few of my friends began to share what they believed. One mentioned the idea of seeing loved ones again after death. Another talked about the comfort their faith gave them in hard times. I listened with impatience, rolling my eyes, waiting for my turn to speak. I couldn't stand hearing them talk about hope beyond this life. To me, it sounded childish, like they were telling fairy tales to make themselves feel better. Finally, I broke into the conversation, my voice louder than it needed to be. I said it with such force that the entire room went quiet for a moment. When you die, there's nothing. End of story. The words hung in the air like a heavy weight. I wanted them to sting, to crush the fragile faith of anyone who still believed. I thought I was being brave, declaring truth in a world of lies. But really, I was just hardening my own heart. The silence that followed felt different than I expected. I thought they would challenge me or laugh along, but most just stared. A couple of them shifted uncomfortably, not knowing what to say. One friend shook his head and muttered under his breath as if disappointed. I told myself they were just too weak to face reality. I wanted to believe their discomfort was proof that I was right, but deep down, it didn't feel like victory. I repeated my words again, softer this time, almost as if I needed to convince myself. There's nothing after death, I said. That's the truth. But the more I said it, the hollower it sounded. My friends eventually changed the subject, eager to move away from the heaviness. They returned to jokes and stories, but I couldn't shake the strange feeling inside me. It was like the words I had spoken out loud had exposed a deeper lie in my own soul. Later that night, when I was alone, I thought about what I had said. I replayed the sentence in my head. When you die, there's nothing. For years, I had believed it silently, but saying it out loud felt different. It was as if my conviction had taken shape, staring back at me. Instead of feeling stronger, I felt a strange uneasiness. What if I was wrong? What if I had just spoken something that was not truth, but rebellion? I quickly pushed that thought away, drowning it with pride. I told myself I had been bold, courageous enough to say what others were too scared to admit. I thought about how weak it was to cling to faith and how strong I must have looked. That sense of superiority gave me a temporary rush, almost like a drug. But when the rush faded, the emptiness came back heavier than before. My words had only deepened the void inside me. Over the next few days, I carried that sentence like a banner. Any time death or faith came up, I repeated it with confidence. When you die, there's nothing. End of story. It became my slogan, my proof of rationality. I thought repeating it would silence the doubts rising in me. But instead, each time I said it, I felt less certain. The more I tried to prove myself right, the more uneasy I became. My words were starting to sound like desperation. I didn't admit it to anyone, of course. On the outside, I looked confident and smug, as if I had all the answers. My friends probably saw me as the bold atheist who wasn't afraid of speaking the truth, but inside, I was battling with questions I refused to face. Every time I mocked faith, I was trying to drown out a whisper that kept haunting me. What if you're wrong? It was a question I feared more than death itself. Looking back, that night was a turning point. I thought I had silenced faith once and for all with those words, but in reality, I had planted a seed of doubt in myself. Saying it out loud forced me to hear how empty my conviction really was. It was as if my own voice betrayed me, echoing with uncertainty. I didn't know it then, but that moment was the beginning of the cracks in my fortress of pride, cracks that God would later break wide open. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, one I expected to pass like any other. I was at work, sitting at my desk, when a sudden wave of dizziness hit me. At first I thought it was just fatigue or maybe low blood sugar, but within seconds my vision blurred and my chest tightened in a way I had never experienced before. My heart raced violently, then slowed in terrifying irregular patterns. Panic gripped me and I realized something was seriously wrong. My co-workers rushed to my side as I collapsed onto the floor. I could hear their voices faintly, urgent and panicked, calling for an ambulance. My body felt heavy, as though it was slipping out of my control. Every breath was a battle, shallow and uneven. I remember trying to speak, to say I was fine, but the words wouldn't come out. Fear, unlike anything I had ever felt, wrapped itself around me, and for the first time, death didn't feel like an idea. It felt real. The paramedics arrived quickly, but time moved strangely in that moment. I could hear the beeping of machines, the rapid exchange of medical terms I didn't understand. Strapped onto a stretcher, I was lifted into the ambulance. The sirens wailed, echoing inside my skull, but I couldn't focus. All I could think was, this can't be happening to me. I'm too young, too strong. I had lived as if death was far away, but now it was breathing down my neck. Inside the ambulance, I felt my body betray me further. My arms went numb, my chest tightened even more, and I gasped for air as though drowning. One of the paramedics shouted something about my heart rate dropping. I caught glimpses of their worried expressions, which terrified me more than the pain itself. If even professionals looked concerned, how close was I to the end? My own mortality screamed at me in a way I couldn't deny. As the vehicle sped through traffic, I tried to cling to reason, but logic abandoned me. All the speeches I had given about death being nothingness suddenly rang hollow. I wasn't calm or fearless. I was terrified. The thought of ceasing to exist, of slipping into eternal darkness, shook me to the core. In that moment, I envied people who had faith. They at least had hope, while I had only despair. I realized how fragile my philosophy was when death came close. By the time we reached the hospital, I was drenched in sweat, barely able to stay conscious. Nurses and doctors rushed me into the emergency room. Bright lights flashed above me as a swarm of hands worked over my body. Tubes, needles, monitors, all of it blurred together. I tried to make sense of their words, but most of it slipped away. What I did understand was this: my life was hanging by a thread, and nothing I believed could save me. The fear only intensified when I felt my chest seize again, harder than before. The monitors beeped erratically, alarms blaring. I saw the doctor's expression shift to urgency, and he barked orders to his team. My breathing grew shallow, my strength fading. Darkness began to creep in at the edges of my vision. I realized I was moments away from something I had always dismissed, the unknown of death. Panic consumed me, but I couldn't fight it anymore. As I faded in and out of consciousness, one thought screamed louder than all the medical noise. What if I was wrong? The question I had buried for years clawed its way back to the surface. If there was nothing, then this was the end. But if there was something, if God was real, then what awaited me on the other side? The possibility terrified me even more than death itself. I was unprepared, utterly vulnerable. At one point, I felt as though my heart stopped altogether. The beeping flatlined for a terrifying second, and I could hear shouting around me. My body felt weightless, suspended between worlds. I didn't know if I was alive or already gone. In that thin line between life and death, every arrogant word I had ever spoken echoed in my mind. My declaration that death was nothingness suddenly felt like the most fragile lie I had ever told myself. Looking back now, that collapse was more than just a medical crisis. It was a turning point. It stripped away the illusion of control I had clung to my whole life. It forced me to face the reality I had mocked and denied. I went into that hospital an atheist, arrogant and confident. But as my life dangled by a thread, I began to see that my convictions were empty. It was the moment when eternity stopped being a theory and became terrifyingly real. I remember the exact second when everything went silent. The monitors that had been screaming suddenly gave one long, piercing sound. My body felt like it shut down completely. I wasn't gasping anymore. I wasn't fighting. I was just still. The medical team around me blurred out of existence as if they had been muted from the scene. My heart had stopped, but what shocked me most was that my awareness didn't stop with it. Instead of sinking into the nothingness I always believed in, I found myself strangely conscious. The pain was gone, the fear was gone, and I was suspended in a place that felt completely outside of time. There was no hospital room, no machines, no voices, just a vast silence. But it wasn't empty. It felt alive, charged with something beyond explanation. I knew instantly this wasn't a dream, and it wasn't some trick of the brain. At first, I resisted the thought. I had always preached that when the heart stops, the lights go out and everything ends. But here I was, fully awake and aware, even though my body lay lifeless behind me. I could almost see it, myself, motionless on the hospital bed, doctors rushing desperately around. It was like I was floating above the scene, detached yet watching. And in that detachment, I felt the truth pressing in on me. Death was not the end. The 3 minutes that followed are hard to put into words. It wasn't just floating or watching, it was feeling. There was warmth surrounding me, an embrace that came from nowhere yet felt personal. A peace unlike anything I had ever tasted poured over me. I'd spent years searching for meaning, pretending I didn't need it, but here it was, undeniable and overwhelming. It wasn't a void, it was presence, a presence that knew me. I can't explain how, but I felt exposed in that moment. Every argument I had used against God, every insult, every laugh at believers, all of it replayed in my mind. It was as if I stood before a mirror that showed not just my actions, but my soul. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel proud of my logic or my science. I felt small, guilty, and desperately aware that I had been wrong all along. The presence didn't condemn me, though. That was the most shocking part. Instead of anger or judgment, I felt compassion so deep it broke me. It was as if a voice, not audible but undeniable, whispered, "You were never alone." Those words shattered me. For years I had mocked the very idea of God, but in that moment I couldn't deny that he was real, and he was here with me, even in my rebellion. Time didn't move normally there. It wasn't 3 minutes as we count them. It felt like eternity compressed into a moment. I had space to feel, to reflect, to realize just how blind I had been. I had spent decades running from faith, proud of my disbelief. But now, standing face to face with undeniable truth, my arguments collapsed like paper walls. I couldn't fight anymore. All I could do was receive the reality pressing down on me. The peace deepened until it felt like being held. I wasn't alone in the void. I was embraced by something greater than myself. All the fear I had in the ambulance, all the panic about nothingness, it evaporated. Instead, there was certainty. I didn't have all the answers, but I knew one thing without doubt. God was real, and he had just revealed himself to me in the most undeniable way. Then, as suddenly as it began, the experience shifted. The warmth started to fade, and the sound of chaos returned. Voices shouted around me, hands pressed on my chest, machines beeped frantically. It was like being pulled violently back into my broken body. My eyes snapped open and I gasped, coughing as air rushed back into my lungs. The 3 minutes were over, but the impact would stay with me forever. When I opened my eyes, the doctors looked stunned, almost relieved beyond words. They had pulled me back, but I knew in my heart it wasn't just medicine. I had crossed a line most never return from, and what I saw there changed everything. My heart had stopped for 3 minutes, but my soul had been more alive than ever. And I came back with a truth I could never again deny. Death is not the end, and God is real. When I had imagined death in the past, I always pictured nothingness, just an eternal blackout, like closing your eyes and never opening them again. But what I encountered was the complete opposite. Instead of void, there was awareness. Instead of darkness, there was light. It wasn't the harsh light of hospital lamps or the burning of the sun. It was softer, deeper, more alive than anything I had ever known. I was awake, more awake than I had ever been. The light surrounded me completely, but it didn't blind me. It felt almost like it was made of peace itself. Every edge of fear, every thought of panic, dissolved in its presence. It wasn't just something I saw. It was something I felt, something I knew. The warmth that came from it sank into me, as though the very core of my being was being healed. For a man who had mocked faith, I now stood inside something I couldn't explain. I thought maybe my brain was tricking me, that it was some final surge of chemicals before the end. But no, this was different. It wasn't chaotic or fading. It was consistent, steady, intentional. The light felt like it had a will, a personality behind it. I couldn't hear words, but I could feel meaning. The message was clear without being spoken. You are not lost. And those 4 words broke every wall I had built inside myself. The calm was so complete that I lost all sense of time. Was it seconds, minutes? It felt like I could have stayed there forever. My body was gone. My pain was gone. But my awareness had never been sharper. I had always believed consciousness was tied to the brain, to neurons firing in patterns. Yet here I was, alive in a way my body could never produce. My old philosophy crumbled in the face of undeniable reality. I wanted to resist, to cling to what I had always believed. But the light didn't demand anything. It simply welcomed me. It wasn't forcing me. It wasn't overpowering me. It was inviting. That made it even harder to deny. For once, I wasn't the one in control. And strangely, I didn't mind. For a man who lived his life trying to prove others wrong, I found myself unable to argue with the truth in front of me. Memories flashed through my mind, almost like the light itself was showing them to me. Times I had laughed at Christians, times I had mocked prayers, times I had proudly declared, "When you die, there's nothing." Each memory stung like a knife, but not because the light condemned me. It didn't. It was me realizing my own blindness. The pride I carried so long now felt so small, so pitiful, in front of something so infinitely greater. The strange part is, I didn't feel hated. I didn't feel judged in the way I expected. Instead, I felt seen fully, every dark corner of me, yet still surrounded by acceptance. It was the first time I had ever felt completely known, and yet not rejected. The calm that came from that realization was overwhelming. I didn't deserve peace, but there it was, wrapping itself around me in that radiant glow. I tried to make sense of it, but human language fails here. This wasn't a vision or a dream. It was more real than the hospital, more real than any physical sensation I had ever felt. If life on earth was a shadow, this was the substance. If my body had been a cage, this was freedom. The light wasn't an illusion. It was the truth that had been waiting for me all along, truth I had denied until the very edge of death. In that brilliance, I understood something I had never grasped before. Death wasn't an ending, it was a doorway, a transition from the temporary to the eternal. And as much as I had fought against the idea of God, I couldn't escape it now. The light was not an it, the light was a who. It carried love, intelligence, and presence. I couldn't see a face, but I knew I was standing before the one I had spent my whole life denying. Those 3 minutes changed everything. What I saw and felt there cannot be dismissed as imagination. I had always demanded proof, mocked believers, and boasted about certainty and nothingness. But the truth was revealed to me in the most undeniable way, through death itself. I had expected the end. Instead, I found life, light, and presence. I went into that moment as an atheist. I came out knowing without a doubt that God is real. What struck me most in that place was not just the light itself, but the presence that came with it. It wasn't abstract or impersonal, like energy or electricity. It was personal, intentional, and alive. I didn't see a figure, no face or shape, but I felt it more clearly than I had ever felt another human being. It was as if every fiber of my soul was known and touched at the same time. This was not imagination. It was encounter. The presence radiated something I had never truly believed in before: love. Not the fragile kind we humans trade when convenient, not conditional or self-serving. This love was unshakable, infinite, and impossibly pure. It filled me to the point where I thought I would burst. For a man who spent years laughing at Christians saying God is love, I now stood in the undeniable reality of it. And it wasn't a concept, it was a person. Alongside that, love was power, raw and absolute. I could sense that with a thought, this presence could have created or destroyed the entire universe. Yet the terrifying part was also the comforting part. That power wasn't being used to crush me. It was holding me, surrounding me, offering me peace. The combination of infinite love and limitless power was overwhelming. I felt smaller than a grain of sand, yet more valued than a treasure. No human has ever made me feel this way. Relationships on earth always came with expectations, disappointments, or hidden motives. This presence had none of that. There was no shadow of manipulation, no angle, no weakness, just a perfection that seemed to stretch beyond time itself. And in that perfection, I didn't feel rejected. I felt invited, as if, despite my years of rebellion, I still belonged there. That realization broke me to tears. I remembered every cruel joke I had made about believers, every arrogant statement, every time I had mocked someone's faith. Standing in this presence, all of it burned with shame. Yet the strange thing was, I didn't feel condemned. I felt forgiven. Not because I deserved it, but because this presence was so full of mercy that it could cover even a heart like mine. I didn't have to beg for it. It was already there, waiting. The longer I stood there, the more I realized that this presence wasn't just powerful, it was holy. That word used to sound meaningless to me, like religious jargon. But in that moment, holiness wasn't abstract. It was perfection, purity, and otherness that no human could ever reach. And yet I wasn't destroyed by it. I was allowed to stand in it, even though I didn't deserve to. That paradox shook me more than anything else. I couldn't deny it anymore. This was God. Not the distant idea I mocked, not the cultural symbol I dismissed, but the living reality of God himself. He was everything I had said he wasn't: near, personal, powerful, loving. And in those moments, every single argument I had clung to as an atheist dissolved like smoke. No debate, no theory, no science could compete with the raw reality of his presence. A part of me wanted to stay there forever. If that presence was eternity, then nothing on earth could compare. No job, no relationship, no achievement had ever filled me the way this did. For once, I didn't care about explanations or evidence. I didn't need proof anymore because I had encountered the very source of truth. And that encounter rewrote the foundation of my life in an instant. But as overwhelming as it was, something else stirred inside me. A realization that my time there was short. I wasn't meant to stay, at least not yet. The presence was strong, but it wasn't pulling me in permanently. It felt more like a glimpse, a gift, a moment of undeniable clarity. And with that came an unshakable truth. I would never again be able to claim that God wasn't real. I had met him. When people ask me now what changed my life, I can only tell them this: I felt him, not an idea, not an illusion, but him, a presence so real, so loving, and so powerful that no human comparison could do it justice. That presence was God, and it shattered every lie I had ever believed. My heart had stopped, my world had ended, but in that ending I found the beginning of something eternal. As I stood in that overwhelming presence, everything felt timeless, as if eternity itself had opened before me. And then it happened. Clearer than any thought of my own, stronger than any imagination, I heard words deep within me. They weren't spoken aloud, but they echoed through every part of me, as if they were written into my very being. The phrase was simple, yet it shook me to my core. This is not the end. I am real. The weight of those words pressed against my soul like a tidal wave. All my years of mocking, doubting, and declaring that death was final collided headfirst with this undeniable truth. This is not the end. That meant life didn't stop at the grave, that my old philosophy of nothingness was a lie. And I am real. Those three words tore down decades of denial in an instant. I had finally encountered the God I swore didn't exist. Hearing that phrase was unlike any human conversation. It wasn't sound in the air. It was truth entering my soul. It was knowledge deeper than language, certainty beyond doubt. I didn't just believe the words, I knew them as surely as I knew I was alive in that moment. For years, I demanded evidence, but no argument could compare to this voice that reached into the deepest part of who I was. I wanted to respond, to say something, anything. My mind scrambled for words, but all that came out was tears. How could I answer God? The arrogance that once made me laugh at prayer melted away completely. I wasn't standing before an idea. I was standing before reality himself. All I could do was weep, because for the first time in my life I understood what it meant to be small and yet loved beyond reason. The phrase repeated in my mind, not harsh, not demanding, but gentle and unshakable. This is not the end. I am real. It felt like both a warning and a promise. A warning because I realized how close I had been to stepping into eternity unprepared. A promise because it meant God wasn't finished with me. He had pulled me back from the brink not to condemn me, but to show me the truth I had resisted my whole life. I thought of all the years I had wasted, declaring myself smarter than believers, priding myself on being free from religion. In the light of those words, my pride looked pathetic, like a child bragging while standing in front of the universe. I had spent my life demanding proof, but when proof came, it wasn't through debate or logic. It was through encounter. And once you meet the living God, you cannot unknow him. The love behind that phrase stunned me. God could have said, "You were wrong," or "You mocked me," or even "You don't deserve mercy," but instead, he simply said, "I am real." There was no anger in his voice, only truth and love. That broke me more than any judgment could have, because in those words I realized he wasn't showing me this to destroy me. He was showing me because he wanted me to live. I can't explain how, but I knew with certainty that this was the voice of Jesus. Not the distant, abstract deity I mocked, but the living Savior Christians had spoken about all along. The words carried his authority, his love, his presence. And suddenly, I understood why so many people would die for their faith, because once you hear his voice, once you know he is real, there is no going back. The phrase burned into my soul like fire, but it didn't hurt. It healed. The wounds I carried from years of emptiness, loneliness, and pride were suddenly covered with hope. If this wasn't the end, then my suffering, my failures, even my near death wasn't meaningless. It was leading me here, to this undeniable moment of truth. For the first time, I felt that my life had a direction beyond myself. When I think back now, those words still echo inside me. This is not the end. I am real. They are carved into me, deeper than any scar, louder than any doubt. They were the proof I had demanded my whole life, but they came in a way I never expected. Not through science, not through logic, but through the voice of the living God. And that one phrase changed me forever. The next thing I remember was the violent rush of air back into my lungs. My chest heaved as if it had been ignited, and I gasped, coughing, desperate for oxygen. Bright lights stabbed my eyes, and the sound of frantic voices filled the room. Doctors shouted orders, machines beeped wildly, and hands pressed against me. My heart was beating again, but what hit me harder than the shock of revival was the memory of where I had just been. Tears poured down my face before I even understood why. I wasn't crying from pain or fear, it was something deeper. I had just stood in the presence of the living God, and now I was back in this fragile, broken body. The doctors thought they had saved me, but I knew the truth. Medicine brought me back physically, but something greater had brought me back spiritually. I couldn't stop sobbing, because I knew my life would never be the same. Everyone around me was relieved, but also confused by my reaction. Nurses tried to calm me, telling me I was okay, that I was safe. But how could I explain that I had just experienced eternity? How could I tell them that I had heard the voice of God himself? Words felt impossible. My heart was racing, not from fear, but from the overwhelming weight of the truth I carried inside me. I had been dead, and yet I had lived. The memory of those words, "This is not the end. I am real," echoed so loudly in my mind that it drowned out the hospital noise. I couldn't escape them, and I didn't want to. I had demanded proof my entire life, mocking believers as weak and delusional. And yet here I was, a man who had crossed the line of death and returned with undeniable evidence. I knew God was real. I had met him. I could never deny it again. In that moment, my pride shattered completely. I realized I had built my life on arrogance, convincing myself I was too intelligent for faith. But lying there, tears streaming, I wasn't proud anymore. I was humbled, broken, undone, and strangely, I felt freer than I ever had before. For the first time, I wasn't trying to hold control. For the first time, I surrendered, because the truth was too big for me to fight anymore. The medical team called it a miracle that I survived. They said I was clinically gone for 3 minutes, that most people don't come back from that. I nodded, but inside I was screaming the real miracle, that in those 3 minutes, God had revealed himself to me. My survival wasn't luck, wasn't chance. It was mercy. Mercy I didn't deserve, but mercy I would never forget. I knew I had been spared for a reason. As I lay in that hospital bed, weak but alive, everything looked different. The walls, the faces of the doctors, even the sound of my heartbeat. It all felt new, like I was seeing through different eyes, because I wasn't just alive physically. I had been reborn spiritually. I had touched eternity and been sent back, carrying with me the unshakable truth that God is not just real, but present, powerful, and loving. I didn't know what the future would hold, but one thing was certain. I could no longer live the way I had before. My old life of mocking, doubting, and chasing empty victories was over. I couldn't pretend anymore. I couldn't hide behind excuses. I had encountered the truth, and once you encounter truth, you're responsible for it. I knew I would spend the rest of my life telling this story. The tears kept coming, not of sadness, but of awe. Awe that God would meet someone like me, a man who had rejected him, mocked him, and lived without him. Awe that he didn't let me die in my rebellion. Awe that he gave me another chance to live, not just physically, but eternally. That realization broke me all over again, and I whispered the first real prayer of my life. Thank you, God. Even now, when I remember waking up, I feel the same weight in my chest. Not fear, not despair, but gratitude. Gratitude that God reached me at my lowest point. Gratitude that he proved himself when I least deserved it. I came back from death with a truth carved into me forever. I had mocked faith, but now faith was the only thing I had. And I knew this with absolute certainty. I could never deny him again. Lying in that hospital bed, I couldn't stop remembering my old words. How many times had I proudly declared, "When you die, there's nothing. End of story." I had spoken them with arrogance, believing I was the rational one. Now those words came back like knives cutting into me with shame, because I had died. And there was something. I had seen it, felt it, lived it. My own voice echoed in my head, mocking me, reminding me of my stubborn pride. The weight of embarrassment was crushing. I had laughed at people of faith, called them weak, naive, even foolish. I had told friends and strangers alike that religion was a crutch for the fragile. And yet when I crossed the line of death, it wasn't darkness that met me. It was light, love, and truth. Every insult I had thrown at believers now boomeranged back into my heart. I had been wrong, completely devastatingly wrong. I felt small, smaller than I had ever felt in my life. The memory of mocking others played like a film in my mind. The smirk on my face, the confidence in my tone, the certainty that I was right. I wanted to crawl out of my own skin, to undo those words, to take them all back. But I couldn't. The damage was done, not only to others, but to my own soul. My arrogance had blinded me, and I was ashamed of the man I had been. It wasn't just embarrassment, it was conviction. For the first time, I realized how much pain my words might have caused others. Somewhere, there were people struggling with faith, people who needed encouragement, and I had torn them down. I had planted seeds of doubt where they might have found hope. That thought made me sick. I wasn't just wrong intellectually, I had been cruel spiritually, and now I saw it with brutal clarity. Tears came again, this time not from awe but from repentance. I whispered apologies into the silence of the room, though no one could hear me. I'm sorry, God. I'm sorry for every word, every insult, every moment I denied you. The shame was heavy, but strangely, the presence of peace lingered too. It was as if God wasn't rubbing my failures in my face, but inviting me to let them go. I had to choose, stay in shame or step into grace. In my old life, shame would have destroyed me. I would have drowned it in alcohol, distractions, or more arrogance. But now, having tasted God's presence, I couldn't do that anymore. I realized the shame wasn't meant to crush me. It was meant to break me free. For the first time, I understood repentance. It wasn't about self-hatred. It was about surrender. I was finally admitting the truth. I had been wrong, and I needed forgiveness. The hospital room became holy ground in that moment. It wasn't just a place of recovery. It was a place of rebirth. I knew I wasn't the same man who had been rushed in hours earlier. That man had died in more ways than one. The new man who had come back was humbled, broken, but alive in a way I had never been before. My shame was real, but so was God's mercy, and mercy was stronger. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how patient God had been with me. He could have left me in my arrogance, let me die without hope, and yet he didn't. He gave me a vision, a voice, a second chance. That realization crushed me even more than the shame. How could I mock a God who was so merciful? How could I have been so blind to the love that had been pursuing me all along? I began to see my past words not as the final mark of who I was, but as a contrast to who I was becoming. Yes, I had declared foolish things, but now my life itself was the proof that those words were lies. My story had changed, my testimony had begun. Where once I had said, "There's nothing after death," now I would proclaim, "There is life, and I've seen it." The shame didn't vanish, but it transformed into purpose. That night in the hospital, I made a decision. I couldn't undo my past, but I could live differently now. I would stop mocking, stop denying, stop running. From that point forward, I would tell the truth, no matter the cost. God is real, eternity is real, and I was living proof. My old words had once defined me, but now they were just the backdrop for redemption. My shame was the soil where faith had finally grown. Lying awake in the hospital, I kept replaying those 3 minutes in my mind. The light, the voice, the presence. It wasn't a hallucination, it was more real than life itself, and the truth sank in slowly but powerfully. I had been given a second chance. Death wasn't the end. I had experienced it firsthand, and instead of darkness, I had encountered eternity. That realization shook me to my core. For years I had lived with arrogance, and now I was humbled by grace. The thought hit me like a tidal wave. I could have stayed there. I could have been swallowed by whatever comes after, without hope, without redemption. But I wasn't. I had been sent back. And if I was sent back, there had to be a reason. I didn't understand it fully, but deep inside, I knew God had spared me. Not to waste my life again, but to finally find truth and live it. That conviction would not let me go. Lying in that bed, I whispered words I had never said before with honesty. "Thank you, God. Thank you for not giving up on me." The gratitude was overwhelming. My body was weak, still recovering from the collapse, but my spirit felt alive for the first time. The shame of my past was real, but so was the promise of a new beginning. For the first time, I didn't want to run from God. I wanted to run toward Him. Over the next few days, as doctors checked on me and machines beeped around me, my mind wasn't focused on the medical details. My thoughts kept drifting to eternity, to what I had seen and felt. I began to read a Bible that a nurse had left on the nightstand. The words were no longer empty or strange. They were alive. Every verse I read felt like it was speaking directly to me, as if God Himself was telling me, "This is your path now." I thought about all the wasted years, the mockery, the pride, the stubbornness, yet strangely, instead of despair, I felt hope. God had not abandoned me even then. He had been patient, waiting for me to come to the end of myself. And when I literally reached the end, He showed up. That thought filled me with a new kind of courage. My past was ugly, but my future could be different. That was the gift of a second chance. As I lay there, I realized this wasn't just about me. My story could be for others too. I knew there were people out there just like I had been, angry, proud, convinced that God was a fantasy. Maybe they needed to hear what I had experienced. Maybe my survival wasn't just for my sake, but so I could share the truth that death isn't the end and God is real. The thought terrified me, but it also gave me purpose. Every morning after that, waking up felt different. Breathing felt like grace. Even eating a simple hospital meal felt like a gift. I had been so close to losing everything, yet here I was, alive. I promised myself that I would never again take life for granted. Every day was now an opportunity to know God better, to honor Him, and to live out this second chance with gratitude and humility. When I was finally discharged, I stepped outside and felt the sun on my face. It wasn't just warmth, it was life itself, reminding me of the light I had seen. I stood there for a long time, breathing deeply, thanking God silently. People walked by without noticing, but for me, that moment was sacred. I was no longer the man who mocked faith. I was a man who had died and returned, forever changed. My journey was just beginning. I didn't have all the answers, but I didn't need them anymore. The arrogance of knowing everything had been stripped away. All I knew was this: God is real, eternity is real, and love is stronger than death. That was enough to rebuild my life on. With trembling hands but a steady heart, I took my first steps into a life I never thought I would live. And as I walked away from the hospital that day, one truth echoed louder than anything else. I had been given a second chance. A chance to live, a chance to love, a chance to believe. Death had not been the end for me. It had been the beginning of everything. In the end, I can only say this: 3 minutes were enough for God to undo years of pride, doubt, and disbelief. In 3 minutes, He tore down the walls I had built against Him, and He showed me a love that was stronger than all my arguments. I went into death expecting nothing, but instead I met the one I had denied my whole life. And now, I cannot stay silent. My testimony is simple. God is real. Death is not the end, and even the hardest heart can be changed in a single moment.